Thank you for joining today's webinar. It looks like most people are able to log in. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. The first is that we are offering, or this webinar has been approved by HRCI for general PHR, GHR, and other HR credits. In order to earn those credits, you must be logged in via the computer. So if you are calling in as an attendee, if you had any trouble logging in via the computer, please send an email through that confirmation email that you received and let us know that you're joining. Otherwise, we won't be able to issue any HRCI credits. Today's webinar is about giving assessment feedback and really the importance of having a map for doing that. So I am Christy Panico, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself and Pinsights, and then hopefully our co-presenter, she's having some trouble logging in at the moment, so hopefully she'll be able to join us today. So in terms of my background is industrial organizational psychology, and I've been in the assessment space, talent assessment, in a number of different roles and areas for quite a while now. So this is a very pertinent topic to my career and to my interests. In terms of Pinsight, we specialize in virtual assessment centers, primarily for leaders and sales professionals. And the virtual assessment centers or simulations are a way to assess talent in a real live situation. So we immerse them into virtual scenarios wherein they encounter tasks that are commonly encountered in their leadership or sales roles. And then we have a team of trained observers that watch what they're doing during that process and evaluate their skill performance. Hopefully Linda will be able to join us today. It looks like she's still having some trouble logging in, but I'll introduce her on the assumption that she'll be able to get in today. So Linda Hall is joining us. She's a registered counseling psychologist in South Africa, and she has more than 25 years of HR training and assessment experience. For the past 15 years or so, she's been an independent consultant offering assessments and simulation services to a variety of clients. And for the past 6 years, Linda has been a key member of our Pinsight assessor and coaching team. So she's one of the individuals that are conducting role plays with our participants, evaluating their performance, and most importantly, coaching and debriefing them after the simulation has occurred. So in terms of the agenda for today, there's 3 main points that we wish to cover. The first is really best practices for sharing assessment results. Beyond that, we're hoping to make the distinction between debriefing, feedback, and coaching, and when it's appropriate to do one versus when you would want to do another. And then finally, we'll offer some actionable tips for building really a development plan. Just trying to see if Linda is able to join us. I apologize for these technical delays. Okay, no Linda yet. So we'll start, before we dive into best practices for sharing assessment results, let's first look at how companies are using assessments for development. So we have seen really a major increase in the assessment use, particularly for developmental purposes, which will be the main focus of the webinar today, over the past 6 years. So the results that are presented here come from a global assessment barometer report in 2016 by CUTE, a global assessment company, and they surveyed organizations worldwide about their assessment use. So we can see in 2010, about 43% of companies reported using assessments for developmental purposes, whereas in 2016, we see about 63% of companies are using assessments for development purposes. These results come from a 2015 Aon Hewitt study, and they suggest that not only are top companies, so they looked at the difference between what are top companies doing versus what other companies are doing, and they found that one of the differentiating factors is not only that they're using assessments for development, but more importantly, that they're using a variety of different assessments. Additionally, 100% of the top reporting companies reported that their assessment and development procedures were explicitly aligned with their talent practices. So top companies are strategically using assessments as part of that larger talent management practice, particularly as it relates to leadership development, high potential development, and then coaching of leaders. And this makes sense given that the Corporate Leadership Council reports organizations with top leadership teams or top tier leadership teams are really outperforming others on average by about 18.8%. So it makes sense that we see this wide investment in developmental tools. However, we know that assessments, not all assessments, but many assessments are proven to be very effective methods for developing employees, assuming that you're using a validated assessment. So why would we see that the majority of companies are using these, but only 8% are reporting performance management is highly effective in driving business value? And this is where the developmental assessments would fall, is within this performance management system. And I argue there's really two logical reasons here. The first being that assessments are either not being used effectively to really maximize their value. And that's kind of what we'll focus on today, is really the follow-up after the assessment and how to maximize that value of assessments. And then the second reason may be that assessments that are being used are not effective or appropriate for that situation. So certainly all assessments are not created equally, and there's a lot of due diligence that needs to go into selecting the appropriate simulation based on the reason. So before diving into exactly what this might look like, what are the differences between feedback, debriefing, and coaching, and best practices for following up, I wanted to start with what is the goal of developmental assessments? And really this can be the goal of developmental activities in general. But the first goal that we often have is fostering self-awareness and insight. And when using assessments, we're hoping to do this using objective metrics. And this objective piece is key, because we know from research that buy-in to feedback is really crucial for fostering self-awareness and insight. If we don't trust the way the data is gathered or the source of that data, we're unlikely to put much weight into it, if any at all. So for the self-awareness and the insight to occur, this objective component is really crucial. The second is providing clear action steps for developing talent. So we don't just want to know where that person is at now. We also need very concrete and specific steps to inform what's going to happen next. The third is allowing for comparison among talent, so sort of a needs analysis in a way. Some companies use assessments to build development plans for groups of talent. In this way, it really serves as a needs analysis, a way to quickly determine what are the training and development needs shared by that group of talent. And then fourth is perhaps the most often overlooked, but an important goal of developmental assessment should be aligning talent with the strategic objectives of the company. And certainly there's probably other goals that go into this, but these are the top 4 goals that we typically see when using developmental assessments. So with that, we'll move to discussing best practices in assessment use and what to do after the assessment is over. And I believe Linda has just joined us. Linda, are you able to hear us?
Yes, thank you, Christy. Sorry, I had some trouble accessing the platform, but it's fine now. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Linda. So as I introduced Linda in the beginning, Linda has quite a bit of experience working with developmental assessments and certainly working within our team of Pinsight and coaching our participants. So we're really excited to have her on this call. Thank you for joining us, Linda.
Thank you, Christy.
So in terms of what's next, what happens after the assessment, and this really does depend on the purpose. We wish to maximize the ROI of our assessments, and for that to happen, it really can't be a once and done activity. So although we'll focus more on the development component, I did want to touch briefly on what are the other uses of assessments and really what's next for those purposes. So starting with selection, this is probably where we see the least amount of follow-up from an assessment. And this does make sense. Of course, there's legal considerations in terms of sharing assessment results in the selection context. However, with the selected candidate, the individual that has been selected to be in that role, it's important to still share those assessment results and really to maximize this value as an onboarding tool. This is a great way to jumpstart the conversation with that new employee to help them understand where they're coming in at and where they need to go to be successful in that organization. So though this is commonly overlooked in the selection context, I would say that that's really a lost opportunity, because this is something that this person has not only invested the time in to get the position and to take the assessment, but it's also a valuable piece of information that can be used beyond just determining if that person's going to be selected or not. The second context is purely developmental. Of course, here follow-up is crucial for maximizing the ROI, and we'll spend the rest of the webinar really focusing on this developmental map and what happens there. And then finally is the case of promotion or succession planning. And similar to selection, this is a blend of selection and development. So we certainly want to follow up with everyone. In the case of promotion and succession planning, we still want to use the results to create a development map. However, there might be more information that we need to communicate ahead of time in terms of what types of information are going to be gathered, how this information is going to be used, and we'll talk about that a little bit more here briefly. The important component for all of these is really defining those next steps before the assessment occurs. So rather than waiting till the assessment is done and trying to determine, okay, what do we do now with these results, really making sure that all of this is very clearly defined and considered before that process occurs. So though we'll focus on what happens after, I think what happens before is crucial to maximizing the value for after as well. So this is a critical step for maximizing those post-assessment conversations. And too often these discussions are really only had after the assessment is completed. And this hurts credibility in the process, it can create confusion or distrust, and it can diminish the overall value. So the things we recommend in terms of explaining before the assessment process to the participant is, first and foremost, why they're being asked to complete the assessment, and providing as much detail as you can. In some cases, you won't be able to provide as much transparency as you wish in terms of the true reasons behind taking this, but as much detail as you can is really important to share. Beyond that is what the assessment involves. Are they taking a personality test, a cognitive ability test, a simulation? What are they going to experience during this assessment process? How long will it take them? What will they be asked to do? Should they prepare in advance? So they know full well going into it what they can expect. Beyond that is who will see the results and how those results will be used. For individuals taking an assessment, it can be an anxiety-provoking experience, particularly if these questions aren't answered for them. They're of course going to wonder who's going to see the results, how these results are going to be used, what decisions will be made based on these results. So providing as much of this information as you can beforehand will help alleviate some of that anxiety and ensure that the participant is truly invested in the process, as well as trust the process. Linda, I know you've had a number of experiences in terms of coaching a participant when some of this information has not been shared before. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that plays out and what that situation looks like?
It's just as you say, the person's not really motivated to be there because they've just been told you need to be there and not why and how, and so there's a lack of buy-in right from the beginning and a sort of a skeptical attitude all the way through. So it's really not the best way to get the most out of the commitment.
Great, thank you. So in terms of follow-up after assessment, there's 3 different ways to help an employee process and use the assessment results for development purposes. And these 3 terms are often used interchangeably, but they truly represent distinct, though overlapping, approaches. And each one of these plays an important role in that post-assessment process. So feedback really helps participants know how they did, how they performed within that assessment. Debriefing helps the participant understand that experience and helps them go through what do others experience through that assessment process and really reflects on the emotions and the cognitions that they had during that process. Whereas coaching is really focused on setting an action plan in place. And all these three work best when they are used together. So we'll go through best practices for each first and define a little bit more about what this looks like. So debriefing, this is typically done in a small group setting, and this is particularly relevant for assessments such as the ones we offer here at Pinsight. Assessments that are high intensity, that are realistic, and that often cause strong emotions and strong reactions among participants. The debriefing allows them to reflect, ask questions, and discuss job relevance, particularly in the case of Pinsight and what we do, because there are no right or wrong answers within the simulation. There's a number of different ways that people can approach any given task, and the different ways can be equally as correct or incorrect. So this debriefing is really critical, especially in a simulation context, because it allows the person to understand and to hear other ways that people approach the task, and to really see that there isn't a one-size-fits-all. There isn't one best approach. And oftentimes I hear from participants, without the debriefing, when they're asked perhaps in a coaching conversation, what are other ways you could have approached that task? They might struggle to come up with other ways. They see the way that they did it, and that's really the only way they can see to do it. That's why they did it that way. So this process helps them understand some of those other ways that they can do it, and how other people approach the task, what other people found challenging or interesting or most job relevant for them. As I mentioned, the focus is on the assessment experience itself. And for this, we aim for 1 to 2 weeks after the assessment, ideally as close to that process as you can, but keeping in mind that we do this in a small group setting. Oftentimes we always recommend waiting until that entire group has gone through. It doesn't make sense to debrief before someone has gone through the assessment, so there might be a little bit more of a lag period there depending on the timing of the entire group to go through that process. The second practice is feedback, and this is unique from debriefing and coaching, although sometimes it can be combined with one of the two, and we'll get into that here in a few moments as well. The goal of feedback is really to help that person truly understand the data that's being reported to them and how they did. So oftentimes the reports from assessments are really intended for trained psychologists. There's a number of assessments out there that the only report, you can only get that report if you have a certain level of credentials in order to understand that report. However, even for assessments that are geared for the individual to understand themselves, it can be overwhelming for them. There's a lot of things going through their mind in terms of understanding that data and what it means for them, how they actually did in that context. And so it's very helpful to have someone who's an expert, who's knowledgeable on that assessment, to be able to guide them through that process and to be able to answer any questions that they did have. The focus here is really on understanding the results and how that person did. And again, this needs to be timely in order to be effective. The assessment and the assessment process should be fresh in their mind. So again, we recommend no more than 2 weeks post-assessment to do the feedback. It is best to do feedback in a one-on-one setting, whereas the debriefing is best in a group. People really appreciate privacy when it comes to their results, and they're oftentimes more comfortable asking questions and really discussing those results in that one-on-one setting. Sometimes this step can be combined with coaching, depending on time constraints and other practical situations, and we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a moment as well. And then finally is the coaching. So the coaching occurs after debriefing and typically after feedback as well. And the goal here is moving to action. So now that the individual has reflected on the experience, they're clear on the report, they're clear on how they did, you can really start to have a very meaningful conversation about development planning. And our coaches are walk through a process with the participant in terms of helping them arrive at some of the answers and self-discovery through skillful questioning. Again, the focus here is on very concrete behaviors and on behavioral change to help move that person to action. So Linda, perhaps you could talk a little bit about how the coaching calls that you've had, and specifically those that have occurred without prior debriefing and feedback, and how the outcome of that call was.
Well, if it's without debriefing then and feedback, then the participant doesn't understand the information, doesn't understand the report. So a lot of time has to be spent going through how did the person do and answering questions about how to navigate through the report. So there's not a lot of time then left to go into actual coaching of what to do with the results and how to put that into a development plan. So the person has a map going forward of how to improve on those points. So it really works best if the feedback is done, if not before, then at the first part of the coaching session, and then there's a chunk of time available to move into the coaching.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Linda. As Linda mentioned, it does really help maximize the effectiveness of that coaching time. As we know, coaching is not an inexpensive resource. It's something that is important to participants, and really to maximize the value and the resources invested in that process. It's helpful to have those debriefing and feedback conversations prior. With that said, so we will offer some best practices in terms of bringing it all together. And the first practical tip here is that sometimes the feedback and coaching can be combined. I don't recommend combining the debriefing with the coaching. Sometimes debriefing and feedback can be combined, but the best combination is really separating debriefing from feedback and coaching in that conversation. The second point here is really defining and communicating these steps before the assessment. So not only defining them internally, what that's going to look like for your internal team and for the participants, but defining this for the participant as well, so that they know once they're done the assessment, they will have a debriefing conversation. It'll be group-based. This will be an opportunity for them to reflect on the experience and hear what others did. After that, they'll hear more about their own results and understanding the report, and then they'll have the opportunity to meet with the coach and actually start developing that action plan. And then the last point here is really building in long-term accountability. So perhaps a coaching session can only happen once, but it's important that the assessment is really more of an ongoing and continuous activity to ensure the value of that and to ensure the impact. So ways to do this are building in accountability. And I put internal champion here because this can take many different forms. So sometimes this is an external coach that has been assigned to that person for a set period of time. But this can also be internal champions. For example, one of the clients that we work with does this very, very well in terms of after the assessment is done, they have a team internally that is trained to do the debriefing, to facilitate the feedback, and to facilitate the coaching. And then they work with that individual on an ongoing basis, or they work in a small group setting for a period of months after the assessment process, constantly coming back to those assessment results and what those mean in terms of driving that development plan. And this allows for it to really be something that has a long-term impact and not a once-and-done activity for that individual. So getting to the development map that we referenced in the webinar description, there's a number of different things that we recommend including in this map. And of course, the first is the starting point. Where is this person at currently? What is their current strengths? What are their skill gaps? And what are they starting with? Beyond that is the estimated duration or the length of the trip. How long do we expect it's going to take them to develop the key skills? What are the key skills that they need to develop, and how long is that going to take for that to translate into effectively executing a strategic priority, for example? What are the stops along the way? So by this I mean, what are some of the challenges that they might anticipate along the way? For example, if their personality is not aligned with this particular skill, how can we communicate that to the person so that they can anticipate those challenges and they can be better prepared to deal with them when they occur or if they occur? Of course, we want to define where are they going? What's the end goal in terms of development and the developmental process? And then lastly is the possible routes to get there. There's certainly not one way to get to the end goal for most participants, and for most assessment participants that are looking for developmental action out of that. So part of the coaching conversation is really defining what are the possible routes for that individual to get there. So now we'll turn to provide some more concrete examples of what this will look like. And Linda will lead us through this, given that she has quite a bit of experience doing this with participants. Before we get into that, I want to explain just briefly what Pinsight, what we do, so that you have that context for understanding. So in the simulations that we offer, participants are immersed in a virtual environment for 3 hours. They assume a fictitious role, and they encounter a number of different tasks that are commonly encountered in that particular role that they're in. And during this process, they have live role plays, they have emails they need to respond to, or plans that they need to develop, and it's a very short time period. So 3 hours might seem like a long time, but it goes by very, very quickly for that participant. And most participants afterwards report that it's still kind of whirling through their mind in terms of what they did or what they didn't do, how they responded, maybe how they could have approached it differently. And that's why the debriefing becomes crucial, allowing them the opportunity to reflect on that and kind of talk through those thoughts that are happening. So now I'll turn it over to Linda, and she'll explain how she typically coaches around a report, what that process might look like, particularly as it relates to our assessment report.
Okay, thanks, Christy. So, so what we do is we blend the feedback with the coaching, and the first part is other than introduce oneself, is also to ask the participant about their role and where they see themselves in the organization, where they're headed, and then ask about the simulation experience and really listen and build rapport and all those important things in order to set the stage for the feedback and the coaching session. And then we'll, depending on what the participant wants, because it's led by the participant mostly, we would go through the report and explaining how the different screens, what the different screens are revealing about how they did in the simulation, and then the participant picks up on a particular aspect that they want to explore further, and then we can go into the details of how they did in the different exercises, and the outcome of all those different exercises. We can look for trends to see whether perhaps they did better in the role plays as opposed to the written exercises, or the other way around. And then once we do that, the understanding the report is there, then we go into the coaching sides and picking up on those areas that they want to develop depending on where they're moving in their career, and then asking really probing questions about how this works out in their job, and if they can improve in that area, what impact would it make, and what exactly do they need to improve, how will they measure that improvement, where to begin with that. The Pinsight also offers developmental suggestions for every behavior. So for example, if it's communication skills, we can click on communication skills, see how they did across all the different exercises, written and the verbal ones, and then go into the developmental suggestions. There are 3 of them, and we can talk about those and see which one's most applicable, and perhaps add other ones if it seems to be more appropriate. And so the session continues with the coach asking the questions in order for the participant to gain real insight and to help them move forward in their understanding of what they need to do to grow their skills, and also recognize their strengths. And at the end, we also ask a very important question. We ask them what they take away from the coaching and feedback session. And that's very valuable, because they then summarize, and I think it really reinforces their insights and learnings. So that takes about 50 minutes to 60 minutes per participant.
Great, thank you, Linda. And I'll add to that. So Linda mentioned that oftentimes we combine the feedback and coaching in that call, and that's really dictated by our clients' needs and what they're facilitating internally. So as I mentioned, we have some clients that are doing the debriefing internally, they're doing the feedback internally, and then that coaching call is entirely focused on that coaching conversation. Most often we see that the debriefing is conducted internally, and then the client's looking for the coach to help process through that feedback and have that coaching conversation as well. So that's why we often see that the feedback and coaching conversation is combined, though that's certainly not always the case, and it's definitely dictated by the client's needs and their internal capability as well. So we have a few screenshots here, and Linda's going to kind of walk us through what it might look like to build a development map based on these particular screenshots, and this is actually a participant that she's worked with recently.
Okay. Christy, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yep.
Okay. So what we do when we start is the report has various business strategies. So in that discussion at the beginning about asking the participant what is their job involve and where are they heading in their organization, we then identify which business strategies are relevant to either their current role or their future role. And we usually select 2 or 3 in order to work with those. But once the participant understands the report, this report is available to them for 12 months. So they can go back and click on some of the other business strategies and see how that would change the results. But just using those 3 business strategies for this person, she's a young person who's new to the HR field, and she does assessments as well. And so she was doing this as a pilot for her organization. And so what we then look so once we go through the explaining the beginnings of the report, building the rapport and asking those initial questions, we then go into the details of the report. And this page is called Skills and Motivation. So the motivation refers to the personality questionnaire that she did beforehand, before starting the simulation. There's an online personality questionnaire which is related to the big 5 personality factors, and then the skills refer to the actual pin site simulation. And then this map shows how they relate to each other. So the green on the far right shows the strengths, and the yellow area moving into orange shows okay but needing some development. So what was interesting for her was that she had many skills. So if you see number 3 was manage priorities, number 5. So those were skills as measured by the simulation, and her personality profile was in line with that. She recognized that she was also strong in those areas. But then if we move down, still on the green side, to 4 and 2, 4 being planning and organizing, 2 being making good decisions, 1 being communicate clearly, the skills were there, but the personality dropped. So her belief in herself was that was not matching what the objective observers recognized in the actual simulation. And then if you look down to number 6, overcome individual resistance, it was a strong skill, but her personality was not in line with it because she did not see herself as having the required qualities to be able to overcome resistance. So it was quite unusual because mostly people rate themselves very highly in personality questionnaires and don't always do so well in the simulation, and that's where our work sometimes focuses on. But this time it was the other way around. So very low scores on the personality side and strong scores, mostly ranging from strong to proficient on the skills side. So perhaps you could just shift this to the next slide, Christy.
Sure.
So then we go to what's called the gap analysis section of the report, and we'll pick up on that communicate clearly on the left. That's a skill. It's in green, so it was a strong skill. And on the personality side, we use the same color coding, green being strong, orange being proficient, and red being an area of development. So whilst she scored very strongly in the simulation on communicate clearly, on the personality side, she rated herself as very passive, very hesitant, very indecisive, very distant, very withdrawn and soft-spoken, but organized and methodical. So that was her view of herself. So when we were going through the report and going into the outcomes, and she was so surprised that she'd done so well. So that was obviously a huge eye-opening aha experience for her, and she said she'd never seen it quite as visible as it was in this report. So I was then able to go into the questioning mode and ask, now, why is this? How does it show in your work? Has it always been there? Is it something new? And what difference would it make in your work if you could view yourself differently? So we went into all of those kinds of questions, and it appeared as if she just had very, very low self-esteem, and it seemed to come from her upbringing, and what she was required to do here through this simulation exercise was to reevaluate herself. So it was a huge eye-opening experience for her. So then we looked at the SWOT slide, Christy. So this is then the sort of the summary of all the strengths, and you probably can't see it very clearly, but the strengths list all the skills at the top there, and some of the personality qualities are listed below which support those skills. I'll just read a few. It's on the strength side: manage priorities, focus on customers, communicate clearly, plan and organize, etc. And then the personality qualities that support that: methodical, systematic, diligent, reliable. If you remember, she rated herself strongly in that area. Perceptive, supportive, cooperative, empathic, and loving to learn. And then on the threat side, that's where all the low scores on her personality questionnaire are recorded, because they actually are a threat to her competence in her job. So if she sees herself as really reluctant to change, passive, hesitant, indecisive, lacking in confidence, distant, withdrawn, soft-spoken, resisting change, she recognized then how much that would be influencing her career as she moved forward in the organization. So we then spent time looking at the development suggestions that the simulation, the PinSight simulation offered, and we spoke also about what she could do to perhaps just put herself forward a bit, maybe just speak up more in meetings, and maybe just have a few points prepared before she goes into meetings so she could confidently express her view and just slowly build up her confidence. We also discussed who she could share this information with, because this was such a huge stretch for her that she needed some support. So she spoke about her HR manager as who was also her kind of mentor, and how she was going to share it with her, and together they were going to work out a development plan of how she could grow her self-confidence and put herself forward, whereas before she would actually retire into the background. So it was very eye-opening for her, and a very rewarding conversation for me, because I could see change happening in that short hour that we had.
Great. Thank you, Linda, for sharing that experience. And so as Linda has pointed out in here, part of the report is really giving the map, and then part of that map is coming from the conversation, that coaching conversation that Linda had with this particular person. So in terms of her starting point, we're able to see that with her strengths. We're able to see what are the strong skills she has now, maybe what are some of the opportunities for development. So these would be where she's headed, or possible stops along the way. In terms of challenges, she's able to see that here through some of the threats that might come into play, so some of those personality tendencies that might hinder her ability to display that skill or to display that skill consistently. And then in terms of where she's headed, we see that through the strategies. So as Linda mentioned, that's really the start of the conversation, is what is the goal here? What is the end goal in terms of where we want to head? What are we hoping to accomplish with this? And then from that, you can start diving into deeper skills. And certainly not all assessment reports are going to provide this level of detail. So some of that may be happening more in that coaching conversation. As Linda mentioned, certainly there was a balance between the information provided in the report and then the coaching conversation that comes out of that. But keeping in mind going into it that these are really the goals, these are the things that a person needs in order to truly make development effective and to really get the most out of those assessments. So with that, we'll move to a couple concluding thoughts here, and then we'll have about 15 minutes or so for question and answer. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the question box at this time. So a few concluding thoughts. The first one is that developmental assessments, and I would argue really most assessments, with the unique consideration of selection maybe being the exception there, should never be once and done. That really to maximize the value and the resources that we're investing in that process, that there's so much more that can be extrapolated from that rather than just handing someone a report or worse yet, not giving them the report at all. There's a surprising number of organizations that don't share those developmental assessments, which of course is minimizing the value. And then the second point is the debriefing and or feedback followed by coaching to really maximize that value. So as Linda mentioned, this individual had debriefed the simulation experience. She understood the feedback and the report, but really the value came in that coaching conversation between the skillful questioning and probing of the coach and the coachee, and in terms of what that means for that individual's development. And then the final point here is really that this not following, not having those next steps or that development map, and keeping that in mind before the assessment occurs, that the organizations and employees are really not getting the full benefit. We're not maximizing the ROI of those developmental assessments, and there really is great ROI to be gained there with the additional steps and the forethought of what those additional steps may be in that process. Now we'll open it up to some questions. And I will see which questions have come in thus far. So we have a few questions here. I'm not sure if we'll have time to get through all of them, but feel free to put in your questions, and then if we don't have the chance to get through all of them, I'll make sure I follow up with you afterwards to answer your question. So the first question is, if a participant is resistant to feedback, how do you create a development plan? Linda, I'll let you answer that if you're comfortable. I think you've encountered that more recently than I.
Yes. I think it really goes back to what you were saying, Christy, about if there's an explanation at the beginning and a buy-in to why they need to do the assessment, that resistance isn't there. It's when it gets sort of imposed on the participant that resistance there. And it's actually very difficult to give development feedback if there's such a resistance. One of the ways through that is to say, well, let's look at the results anyway, and let's pick out what you do see as relevant to your role and how you're performing in your role, and let's see if there's something there that's useful that you can take away with you. So a mistake would be to become defensive about the process, because that would just annoy the participant, I think. But to really just hear their annoyance and their resistance and work with what is available. That's probably the best that you can do.
Great, thank you, Linda. Another question that came in is regarding the value of debriefing. So the question is, I mentioned that debriefing is especially important in a simulation assessment. Is this something that's important for other assessments as well? I'll take a stab at answering that, and then Linda, if you have anything to add, please feel free to jump in. In terms of the debriefing component, of course, not all assessments are as intense as a simulation. They're not all as involved. There's not as much challenge or considerations, decisions that have to be made during that process. So, for example, if we think of completing a personality questionnaire, does that really need to be debriefed? Does that simulation experience need to be debriefed? And I find that although that conversation might be shorter, and there might be less to reflect on in terms of that experience, it's still a powerful conversation to have for getting buy-in and for making sure that the individual feels comfortable and is heard in terms of their concerns. So oftentimes, and I certainly think this is changing, but I think assessments are viewed negatively. When employees are asked to take an assessment, they immediately assume they did something wrong or there's some ulterior motive there, and that's definitely going through their mind as they're answering it as well. So I've had many debriefing conversations around a standalone personality tool wherein that person wanted to talk through some of the specific items, some of the challenges they had in responding to those items, some of the thought processes that they were going through when they went through that process. And out of those conversations came more valuable information in terms of guiding development and the person reflecting on both how they answered and what their results mean, and ultimately what that means in terms of job relevant behaviors and job relevant performance. So to answer the question in a kind of a long-winded way, I would say yes, there's still value in debriefing tools that are not simulation assessments, that conversation might be shorter, it might look a little bit differently, but that there's really always value in debriefing an assessment experience. Linda, is there anything you would add to that?
No, I think you said it all, Christy.
Thank you. Okay. The next question is, coaching is time-consuming and costly. How much value does it add to the feedback process? I think Linda has spoken to this quite a bit in her example in terms of the additional value that was added in this particular case. But Linda, is there anything more that you would add in terms of the value that coaching adds to that feedback process?
I think it takes it a step further, way beyond what general feedback offers, and it really shifts behavior. I've seen it happening kind of very quickly. Things that perhaps a training program would take a long time to achieve, if at all, I've seen how coaching around assessment results can shift people within an hour, and it's really remarkable. So I believe it's truly valuable, and it adds a whole other dimension to the assessment experience for both the participant and the organization.
Thanks, Linda. And I'll add to that in terms of the component about coaching being time-consuming and costly, and certainly it is. It's not an inexpensive option, but I think there are variations on coaching that can be done. So, for example, as I talked about before in terms of internal champions, maybe the resources aren't in place to hire, certified external coaches to come in with each and every leader on a regular basis. But there's still opportunity, for example, peer coaching. I've seen this done very, very effectively in a number of situations wherein given a basic outline and some basic questions that they can ask and some skills in terms of coaching, that informal coaches can also offer value and can also add to that process. So speaking to the part about coaching being time-consuming and costly, I agree that it is, but I think the value certainly outweighs the investment on that. And likewise, I think there's variations. There's ways to make that scalable for the organization depending on the resources that they do have available. It looks like we have time for maybe one more or two more questions. Let me just look through these real quick and see. This one seems a bit more specific to the work we do at Pinsight, but I think it's relevant for this discussion. So the question is, isn't it enough to just do a personality questionnaire? What is the additional value of a simulation? Linda, do you want to speak to that, having coached many participants on simulations and other assessments?
Yes, a personality questionnaire is a person's view about themselves. It's a subjective view, and it's only as accurate as their willingness to be honest and their insight into themselves and their maturity. But it's always subjective. So when against that you have a very objective assessment tool that is where they are trained objective observers evaluating the participants' responses and doing role plays. So it's a completely different experience, and it's objective as opposed to subjective. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people particularly people who are very confident and doing well in their careers, can perhaps see themselves in a somewhat inflated way. So the personality questionnaire will come up as great on everything. But when they do the simulation, it's actual observable behavior, it can look very different. And obviously that gap can be quite eye-opening for them and perhaps a little bit difficult for them to acknowledge. But if they could just open their minds to it, it could be a huge development opportunity. And if you think, and also then thinking of the example I shared earlier, where this young woman, her personality questionnaire showed a lot of negativity and not great qualities for the corporate world of work. And whereas the skills that were measured in the objective simulation showed incredible strengths. And so that difference was remarkable, and it wouldn't have been highlighted if she'd just completed a personality questionnaire. So I think the personality questionnaires add value to the simulation, but I don't believe personality questionnaires can stand on their own. I just don't see them as valuable enough or objective enough.
Great, thank you, Linda. And I'll add to that in terms of it being, different pieces of information. So the simulation is going to give us information about that individual skill performance, the behaviors they did engage in or did not engage in, and from trained objective observers. Whereas, as Linda mentioned, personality is giving us information about how that person views themselves. And so I think that the more information you have, the better, knowing that we're never going to arrive at a 100% complete picture. So the purpose of assessments is to help us understand that person, to help us predict what their strengths are, what their development needs are, and how they're going to be successful in that role. And so the more information we have to make that prediction, the better that prediction will be. So I think using personality in concert with the simulation, or also with maybe a cognitive ability tool, that there's a lot more value. It helps us arrive at a bigger truth or a more real truth by using that different type of information and integrating that information to see what are the commonalities here, what are the inconsistencies. I think we are right about out of time, so I'm not going to have an opportunity to address the rest of the questions, but I will follow up individually with those that asked, and I apologize we didn't have time to get to those questions. However, if you do have additional ones that you weren't able to put in the chat box or that you didn't want to share today, please feel free to reach out to either Linda or myself. Here we have both my email address as well as Linda's, and I know I can speak for both of us when I say we'd be happy to answer any questions after this webinar. So thank you very much for your time today. And if you are looking to get HRCI credits, I will mention that there'll be a brief survey after this webinar, and that's where you'll want to indicate that that you would like to get those credits. And then we'll be sure to send out the activity link to all those that indicate they're wanting to get those credits. Thank you again, and have a great day.
Thank you, Christy.
Thanks, Linda. Take care.